My name is Olivia Mattis. I'm president and co-founder of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And today's program is part of a series of programs that we have been running every Sunday during the COVID period in order to provide beautiful stories of hope. And certainly today's story is a remarkable, unique story of hope. And we are so privileged to have the film's director with us, as well as really the world's expert on rescue during the Holocaust period. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to the film director, JOSH ARONSON. And I'm wondering, Josh, if you can simply wave to people and say a few words of greeting.
Hello, everyone. And thanks for coming out on what's in America, a beautiful day. And for those of you who watched the film for the first time, I hope you enjoyed it. And those who've seen it again to do this, thank you for checking in again. And hello, Sven. I see my line producer from Berlin is with us, and he was with me in a great support for the film, and it's just a pleasure to see him. Just briefly,
before we go into any detail, I just want to introduce both of you, and then we'll start the program. Yeah. I'm sorry, Josh. I know you have a lot to say, and you will get a chance to say it all. So now let me turn the program to Dr. Mordecai Paldiel, just to say a quick word of hello to all of our participants today. Dr. Paldiel?
Hello to everyone. My name is Mordecai Paldiel. I worked for 24 years at Yad Vashem. I was the head of the Department for the Righteous Among the Nations. In other words, rescuers of Jews. Mostly I dealt with non-Jews, rescuers of the Jews, not Jewish rescuers of Jews. During my 24-year tenure at Yad Vashem, I never heard a story of BRONISLAW HUBERMAN, or maybe I just heard it in passing. But it's something a story which was hidden. And it's not known among the public or those people who are interested in the Holocaust. And so I'm very glad that JOSH ARONSON has made this movie. And we have one of the most remarkable stories to come out of persons who saved Jews from Nazi Germany and got them out in time when it was still possible to get out of Europe and get out of Germany.
Thank you, Dr. Paldiel. So let's start the program with Mr. Aronson, JOSH ARONSON. And at a certain point during the program, we'll open it up to Q&A, but right now we're just going to let our speakers speak and have a dialogue with one another. So Josh, why don't you start us out?
Well, I thought I would just in a very brief way, tell you how I came to make this movie. I'm a Jew from Missouri, and I grew up as a conservative Jew first and then Reformed Jew later, and went off to school and went about my life as a totally assimilated American Jew. And you might have called me a twice-a-year Jew at a certain point. And I've made documentary films for about 20 years. And after you've made films for a while and they get out in the world, everyone you know comes to you with an idea for a story. And so someone who's actually on this call named Dorit Strauss came to me and told me about a story about her father, whose name was David Grunschlag, who was saved by someone in 1936, taken to Palestine to join an orchestra. And she told me what an amazing story it was and how I ought to make a story about her father. And, you know, it didn't grab me particularly. I didn't know much about her family, and I went on with my life. And being Israeli, she was kind of tenacious. She kept coming back and she kept telling me what a fantastic story it was. And because she's my friend and I love her, and she's a pianist and musician, as I am, I followed up and went deeper, and I looked into the story, and I found the story of the man who saved him, whose name was BRONISLAW HUBERMAN. And what I found in this story was the dream of any dramatist, which was, here was a man who was one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. He was a violinist. He was a person who effectively started the culture of Israel and effectively saved 1,000 Jews from the Holocaust. And he was completely forgotten in the mainstream. No one had written a book about him, and no one had ever made a film about him. And I thought men like that should not be forgotten. And so I dove in, and with Dorit's help, we made this film. And it's been the joy of my life, I must say, because the other invitation to me was, being the kind of Jew I described, I had never read the Holocaust literature and I'd never seen all the films. And it was a reason, and it was a call to do all of the reading. And it changed my life. It was quite a powerful experience for me. And I feel very honored to be, on this panel with Mordecai, who's a great expert in this area, and will have much to say on the idea of Jews saving Jews, because that's a passion of his. And as I was raising money for this film, one of the things that foundations told me over and over again that interested them was, here was a story of a Jew saving Jews. And there'll be much to say about that as we go along. So let me pass it over to Mordecai. And I'm curious, Mordecai, what led you to this particular passion amongst your many expertises about the research on Jews who save Jews?
Well, here we have a person who in 1934, he had a sense of an approaching doom of the Jewish people, not only in Nazi Germany, but throughout Europe, because anti-Semitism was on the rise in neighboring countries, and in France and Poland and Romania and so forth. And he had a prescience, a prophetic feeling that something terrible was going to happen, while many other pundits felt that Hitler was not going to last long, and that was just a phase in Germany, and Germany would get back to its senses. He didn't feel like this. So he asserted leadership, while the mainline Jewish leaders and the Zionist movement or outside the Zionist movement were struck with a certain paralysis. They couldn't figure out what's happening in Germany. The homeland, the culture, the beacon of light that every Jews looked up to, what was happening there, and will it get worse? I mean, is this only something that will pass? And what he said, when he felt it's going to get worse, then he decided that he was going to try to top the Nazis, and he was going to create a Philharmonic orchestra that will match the best that the Germans had. The Philharmonic in Berlin that was led by the legendary Furtwängler, and he was going to get Jewish people, not just musicians, but renowned musicians, prodigies, and in order to instill self-confidence in them. And where was he going to get them? Was he going to get them someplace in France, to Mexico, to Argentina? No. He was going to get them in a place where nobody would think that they needed a Philharmonic Orchestra. Palestine in 1934 was still quite backward compared to other countries in Europe. There were riots by the Arabs. No one knew what was going to happen. He had a feeling that something is going to happen in Palestine, that the Jewish community are going to establish there's something great and important. And therefore, they needed a Philharmonic Orchestra. They had to show to the world that the Jews can produce something similar to the Berlin Philharmonic. You know, I studied the Holocaust, and even in the worst place on earth, in Auschwitz, there was an orchestra of musicians that were standing at the gate when people were let out to work. And it was led by the niece of Gustav Mahler, the famous Gustav Mahler in Vienna. So the Nazis, that's one of the aberrations of the Nazis. One of the weirdest things of the Nazis is they loved music. They even loved classical music, even Hitler and some of the others. They felt that Jews cannot be great musicians. Well, he was going to show them, Huberman, that Jews can be great physicians, and he was going to bring them to Palestine, Eretz Israel as we call it. Although it was not the most attractive place for musicians, he faced even the Zionist leadership, the leader of the Jewish agency in Palestine, like the self-government, the Jewish self-government in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, didn't even like the idea of musicians coming. He wanted young people to come and cultivate, establish kibbutzim, cultivate the land, build up the cities, not musicians. And he felt that these musicians may even not stay, they'll go back to Europe. The other person in the Zionist movement was Jabotinsky, and he felt that every Jew should be. So anyway, he had to fight, he had to contend also with the Zionist movement. He had a person on his side, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, And he finally pulled it off in December 1936 amid the most terrible riots that broke out in Palestine. And not only did he pull it off, but he broke Toscanini, the most famous conductor. Toscanini, who got a letter from Hitler inviting him to come to Germany, and he turned it down. Incidentally, Huberman also got a letter from Furtwängler, approved by the Nazis that he should come to Germany and perform. So here is this renowned and this prodigy, this violinist, in 1936, in December 1936, with Toscanini, and this thing establishes the Philharmonic Orchestra, which is now world renowned. It's called the
Mordecai, can I just interject? You've summarized our entire presentation, which is actually great to have the advance of it. But can I just kind of circle back, and then we'll sort of go forward and just talk a little bit more about who Huberman was as a Jew, which was the theme we started with, which is about a Jew saving Jews, and what motivated him and what brought him at that time, which was 1934 really, or actually 29 was the first time he went to Palestine. He saw the need for an orchestra, and going back in 34, he became a Zionist and realized, had the aha moment that this was the time that we could do it by getting Jews out of Central Europe. Now, Huberman had always been a man who was completely self-absorbed. He was an artist. He'd been abused by his father, and he had no inclination to help anyone or do anything. He had a sea change in his life at a certain point and became an altruistic man, became a Zionist, and changed. What changed him was a fascinating story of a Jew becoming a mensch who recognized that he had the power and he had the connections all over Europe to be able to do this. And then he had the vision to do it. It was a very, very unusual situation. And he basically dedicated all of his fees and all of his work to being able to make this orchestra happen. And the idea that you so ably, sort of delineated, it came to him that it was not just to create an orchestra in Palestine, because there was a need for an orchestra in Palestine, but also that he could make this orchestra be a fist against Nazism. Because if you take exiled Jews with the greatest conductor in the world, who was famously anti-fascist, bring them to Palestine and make music at the highest order, it was a slingshot right at Hitler, and Hitler couldn't stand it. And there was back and forth, and it was quite powerful. And of course, Toscanini signed on only to be able to do that. And that's what was so extraordinary about Huberman, that he became that man and he evolved into that person. And the story becomes incredibly complex, as you see in the film and as you started to delineate. So
yeah, I simply want to add about Huberman, the discussion about anti-Semitism. He came from Poland, from a city, from Częstochowa. Yep. He came from a country which had quite a history of anti-Semitism and pogroms. So he didn't have to be taught the danger of anti-Semitism. He comes from Poland. He doesn't come from someplace from New Zealand or Australia. And so he realized that anti-Semitism in the 1930s was on the rise and was going to get worse. And that's why, as you explained, Josh, he dedicated himself as a Jew to help fellow Jews. All of his musicians were Jews. And it was like to fight back at the Nazis. It's something that they were very sensitive. They were sensitive on music. He's going to show them what Jewish people can do on music in Palestine. Yeah. And so he had this sense of anti-Semitism, and he felt himself as a Jew that he is going to fight anti-Semitism in his way. He's not going to join the Zionist movement. He's not going to join the Joint Distribution Committee. He's not going to join any organization, because there he was going to run into red tape. He's going to be stopped. And I know a lot about red tape because I worked in an organization that was dedicated to the Holocaust, and there's red tape. So he organized his own Huberman organization to get these people out, to convince them to come to Palestine, and he succeeded.
Yeah, interesting what you said about he had this dance with Hitler because he was doing this. He was pulling musicians from Germany. When Hitler banned music of Jewish musicians at a certain point, I'm not sure the year, but probably it was 34, 35. And he wouldn't let the Berlin Philharmonic or the Kulturbund orchestras play any music of Mendelssohn, for instance, or Mahler at a certain point. Immediately, Toscanini programmed Mendelssohn on their program with the Orchestra of Exiles for that, and that was exactly the reason to have Mendelssohn playing, you know, at Hitler. It was very important. And you know, one of the things, as just to sort of as a sidebar, that's so interesting that you mentioned, years after, there was a find in Moscow. Someone died, and in the attic of their home, it was a soldier in World War II, they found a box that he had actually stolen from Germany. And it was a box of records from Hitler's lair. And it was the records that Hitler had actually played and his favorite records of throughout the war, what he listened to. And it was Huberman and it was Schnabel. It was the two Jews that he listened to all the time. It was so fascinating, really something.
And I'd like to add something else about going to Palestine. The country was not open. It has the British, the country was controlled by the British. And they were leaning more to the Arab side of the argument. And they had what is called a quota. We all know what quotas are. Yep. And the quota was always restricted. So when the British established a quota, and then the British would hand out what is called certificates. A certificate is a British document which is given to a Jewish person in Europe and telling him you are allowed to come to Palestine as an immigrant. The certificate, if the British established a quota, let's say of 50,000, then that was turned over to the Jewish agency, and then the Jewish agency would distribute the certificates to whomever they felt was needed for Palestine. Yep. And that's why I mentioned before Ben-Gurion, who I'm a great admirer of him. He created the state of Israel and brought Eichmann to trial. But Ben-Gurion wanted to bring in people who would build up, who would get their hands dirty and build up, and not so much play music. And that's why, without Ben-Gurion's agreement, Huberman could not get the British certificates and could not bring these people to Palestine. So that's what I meant before, that he had to convince the Zionist leadership that music is as important as a pick and an axe and a hammer to build up a viable and civilized Jewish community.
Yeah, I mentioned to you the other day, the little known fact that the way Huberman, who was a great strategist in all these matters, was able to get Ben-Gurion to agree to give him the certificates was Golda Meir, because he met Golda Meir in 1934, 35, somewhere in there. He met Golda Meir on a plane from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And she was traveling for Ben-Gurion, raising money for Israel, for Palestine, for the future Israel. And they met. And he shared with Golda Meir what his dream was. And of course, Golda Meir was a great lover of music. Her son was a cellist in Israel. I interviewed him for this film, trying to get more information about the story I'm now telling. Didn't have enough to include it in the film. But she was so engaged by Huberman and by his tale of what his plan was and the need for culture to be part of the growth of Israel, that when she went back to Ben-Gurion, she lobbied Ben-Gurion, and she was relentless. And ultimately, the original certificates that Ben-Gurion approved, the permanent certificates he approved for Huberman, were because Golda Meir pushed him. And he later rescinded those certificates because with the when the crunch came in the Arab riots of '36, he pulled all of the certificates. And of course, Huberman, as we see in the film, had to go around him because it was two lions at war, the two of them. And he had the strategic thought of going to Chaim Weizmann to get them. And ultimately, he got them created by Sir Arthur Walcott, the High Commissioner of the British Mandate. And so he's given those 70 certificates separate from all the certificates that Ben-Gurion had. These were the kinds of things that I found in my research that as a filmmaker excited me, because I had a story of a guy who changed so dramatically in the course of his life to be able to do this. And we had a drama with a fantastic climax and a wonderful outcome and a very feel-good Holocaust era story. So it was catnip for a filmmaker.
I just want to add something about certificates. When he had already the certificates and the musicians were ready to go, suddenly the British government they closed Palestine because of the riots, and they closed the movement of people to Palestine. So no one can come to Palestine until the riots would stop. So he had a problem with the British High Commissioner, that's the title, High Commissioner, the governor, woke up. And he had also to battle the British in order to get their permission to open the gates of Palestine for his musicians who had already their passports ready and they had their certificates, and he wanted them to come because they were preparing in Tel Aviv and Toscanini and everything. So, I mean, this is something extraordinary person that we don't know, and it's a shame we don't know enough about him. He saved so many Jewish lives, and he created music. And today, everybody in Israel is proud of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, and they've heard the name of Huberman, but they don't know much about it except the name.
They think it's a street. It's a street that goes right next to the Israel Philharmonic. The intersection. The Israel Philharmonic is at the intersection of Toscanini and Huberman Street. Rehov Toscanini, Rehov Huberman, and that's what people know, the street. And I know you're dedicated to the idea that Yad Vashem would allow in the education department to recognize Jews who saved Jews. How's that effort going?
So at Yad Vashem, they have this World War II ideological thing that a Jew who helps a Jew, well, there's nothing to brag about because that's what he's supposed to do. So let's just forget him. But if a Gentile saves a Jew, then we have to salute him and we have to give him a nice dinner. We have to give him a medal and a tree and so on. And Yad Vashem was created in 1953 at a time, I did some research on Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem was created in 1953 when Ben-Gurion learned that the French were going to create their Shoah Foundation in Paris, and he felt, no, Israel has to have it. But so Israel has to be the first place. But until he learned about the competition from Schneerson in Paris, in Israel, they were not happy to have a Shoah institution. To celebrate what? 6 million Jews dead? So the only thing that saved the situation where they could point out the Jewish resistance, like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, like the partisans, Jews with guns who fought against the Germans. Why? Because that would cinch in with what happened in Israel recently. Israel was fighting the Arabs and held back the Arabs in 1948. So what's important for the Israeli youth is to learn about David and Goliath, about Samson and the Philistines, about Judah Maccabee, about Bar Kokhba, the heroes who fought physically, and the people and Jewish people who brought musicians. That's not at that time, it wasn't considered something heroic. So Yad Vashem was created in that atmosphere in the country, okay? So Yad Vashem only added the thing that if a Gentile, the attitude in Israel was the whole world was against us. Everyone's against us. The Zionist philosophy is we can't trust anyone. We can only trust ourselves. We need a country for ourselves. We can't trust anyone. But there were a few exceptions. These are the righteous Gentiles. So we will point out these righteous Gentiles and we'll salute them and we'll tell their stories. But as far as Jews saving Jews, that has been downplayed and it's still being downplayed. Yad Vashem has not changed that policy, that honoring Jews who save Jews. There's nothing that can be done in that respect. We can thank them, but this is not something that we can talk a lot and we can magnify, because every Jew has got a responsibility to save a Jew. So the only thing, according to that thinking, is to say to Huberman, he was a good Jew, that's all. But that is changing. Slowly it is changing. There are no more voices in Israel, and I belong to a certain group of people which is associated with B'nai B'rith, and we do honor Jews who save Jews. Olivia Mattis' grandparents were honored by this organization. Chaim Perlman and his wife Fella in Belgium, they created the clandestine rescue operation in Belgium, Comité des Défenses des Juifs. So I hope that I am almost sure that Huberman is going to be honored by B'nai B'rith under their program.
Oh, wonderful.
As far as Yad Vashem is concerned, we still got a long fight for that.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we talked about the other day when we met, which interests me greatly, is the Furtwängler story. Furtwängler, and you know a lot about this. Furtwängler was very interesting. He was another antagonist with Huberman, as you see in the film. Furtwängler was the longtime conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. He and Toscanini were the two greatest conductors in the world. And And Toscanini battled with the powers that be because there were so many Jews in the Berlin Philharmonic that he had to have. He needed them because they were among the best players. And he negotiated to keep them. Ultimately, he lost all of them. They'd all left. They were either pushed out or they left on their own. But he sort of made a deal with the devil in order to stay and get funding. And he stayed throughout the war, although he never became a Nazi. But he invited Huberman to come and open the 1934 season. And after Hitler came to power, Huberman, despite the fact that Germany was his biggest audience anywhere, he made half of his income from Germany, Huberman said he would never play in Germany as long as Hitler was in power. And Furtwängler tried to get him to come, and he refused over and over again. And he finally caused Huberman, in their back and forth polite and then more and more antagonistic letters, Huberman coined that line, and he said Furtwängler was among those non-Nazi Germans who made Nazism possible.
That's right.
Billions of non-Nazi Germans who made Nazism possible. And that's something that was seared into me the first time I heard that.
I want to add something more, that Huberman not only had to contend with some people, the Zionist movement, and with the British, he had to contend with his own friendly Jewish people. In Germany, there was a man by the name of Singer, and he collected all the German Jewish musicians that they could not perform, and he created what is known as the Kulturbund. And these musicians, he told them, well, if we cannot perform before German audiences, we'll perform for Jewish audiences, and there's no rush to leave Germany. We'll continue to create music. And so there were many, many German Jews who, instead of leaving Germany, if they had a chance, they stayed behind. They stayed behind until it was too late. Later on, the Kulturbund was disbanded, and Mr. Singer himself was sent to Theresienstadt, where he died. Theresienstadt was one of the large ghettos. So Huberman had to contend with some other musicians who felt that, again, as I said at the beginning, that Hitler is only a phase, and Germany was going to get back to its senses. He was right. Germany did go back to its senses, but look in what way. It was too late for 6 million Jews when Germany got back to its senses.
And also, Singer, there's a section in the film about the Yiddischer Kulturbund, as you remember, and we get to know Singer a bit.
You pointed it out, yeah.
Singer believed that he could control the SS who was controlling him. He believed that although he had to get permission for all the sets and for all the programs, he believed that he could control them because he knew he was brilliant. He knew that they respected him, and they did respect him artistically, and they allowed him to do it. All the while, of course, they were using him, because by forming the Kulturbund and having 70,000 Jews in Germany with cards, Kulturbund cards, it essentially was a record of all the Jews that were members. So they knew where they all were. So it was all in the service of the SS. And they
right now, I'm going to jump in. We're at the halfway point, and people are already starting to put questions into the chat window. And I would encourage you to put more questions into the chat window. So let's see. Before we get to the questions, I just want to turn everybody's attention to a couple of upcoming events while I have everybody's attention. So next week we're showing a fish called we're showing a film called The Starfish. We're not showing a fish. We're showing a film called The Starfish, which is the story of a single family. So we're going from this week, which is a collective rescue action, one man saving a lot of people in a single project, to the story of one family among thousands that were saved by Highest. So that's a different type of a lens to look at rescue. That's another free program. I think the film rental might be $1 or $2, but the program itself is a free program. And then the week after that, we're taking a look back out, which is we're looking at 4 diplomat rescuers who did large-scale rescue. And between the 4 of them, they saved perhaps 100,000 people. So that's a whole other different type of lens for looking at rescue during that period. We're focusing on 4 rescuers: Aristides de Souza Mendes, represented by, of course, the Souza Mendes Foundation; the Swiss Karl Lutz, and we're doing this in cooperation with the Cercle Karl Lutz in Switzerland. He was a Swiss man, as I said. We also have the American Hiram Bingham, and we're privileged to have Bingham's daughter, Abigail Bingham Endicott, who is a singer-songwriter and who wrote a song about her father's action that she'll be sharing with everyone along with her reminiscences. She was the 9th of his 11 children, and she has a lot to say about her father and his rescue action. And the 4th rescuer is actually a German, Georg Duckwitz, who almost single-handedly saved all the Jews of Denmark. And we have one of them, Leo Goldberger, who will be with us to tell about what Duckwitz means to him and his life. So it's going to be, I think, a very wonderful program. That one is a ticketed program, so there's a fee, but the ticket is whatever you would like to donate. And the donations are 100% tax deductible. We suggest the price of $18, which is high, meaning life. But if you want to give less, if you want to give more, that's fine with us. So I do hope you'll sign up for our upcoming programs, and the information will be in the email you'll receive after this program. So now turning back to this program, let's start getting to some questions. So here's a question for Josh. And the question is, you mentioned abuse from his father. Does that refer to the pressure, the father's pressure, and having him always practicing and performing at such a young age?
Any prodigy has a parent. There's no prodigy that becomes a virtuoso violinist without a parent pushing. And as in my interview with Pinchas Zuckerman, you see in the film, Pinchas talks to this point. Pinchas Zuckerman was fortunate. He was a prodigy on the level of Huberman, of course, as was Itzhak Perlman also in the film, and they both spoke about this. They were fortunate in that they had benevolent, compassionate, loving parents who really nurtured their love of music. Huberman's father was different. Huberman's father was more like Leopold Mozart. He saw money. And he saw putting his son out in the world as a way to make money for the family, and he dedicated himself to it. And he denied him an education, he denied him a childhood, he denied him family, his relationship with his brothers. And until Huberman was 20, he was put on the road to make money, and his father scarfed all the money. So the abuse was that. It was child abuse. It was certainly not physical abuse, but he denied him a life. And he scarred his personality forever. And recovering from that to become the altruistic, giving man that he became was a life journey. And that was part of the story that was fascinating. And I call that abuse, yes.
But Josh, you also mentioned the other day when we spoke about Huberman's son and how they were estranged, and maybe there was some abuse in some way that was passed on, maybe in the form of neglect. So I don't know if you could speak to that.
You know, it's conjecture here, and you can decide psychologically how one wants to think about this, but you're absolutely right. He basically was not a good father to his son. His wife left him for Dochnani, the conductor actually, who was a very good friend of Huberman's, and Dochnani adopted his son, which is odd to even think about it because Huberman was alive. How could that have happened? He adopted his son, and Huberman, although he paid for his education, spent very little time or energy with his son. His son went with him to Palestine for his second tour in 1934, but other than that, very little time was spent. And when the Israel Philharmonic in 1987 did a centenary concert of Huberman's birth, they invited Huberman's son, and he refused to go. So he felt very, you could say, abused. I don't know if that's it's certainly not the level that Bronislaw Huberman was. He was an artist on the highest order with a mission, and men like that often are not the best fathers. What can we say?
Isn't that the story with Maria Callas and her mother? Maria Callas and her mother, that she also abused him. She forced Maria to develop her voice and to be a diva. And that's why they had a very bad relationship, Maria Callas and her mother. Maybe you've heard about.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So here is a different type of a question. It's, I don't know which one of you wants to answer. It has to do with how is it that Huberman was so easily able to travel between Palestine and Central Europe and Eastern Europe? Why wasn't his own travel restricted in those?
He was on a tourist visa. You could come to Palestine as a tourist, but you had to leave within a specified time,
Right.
several weeks, a month or two. There were no restrictions on tourism.
Also, within Europe, until 1938, there was no restriction on traveling at all. You could leave Germany until 1938. I mean, they might take all your money, but you could leave if you could find a place that would take you. That's a whole nother story that Mordecai and I could get into about the countries that wouldn't allow Jews in. But you could leave Germany. There was no blockage there until after the Anschluss in Austria. But Huberman was special also because he was a world star. So people of that order had no problem moving around.
So what happened to Huberman?
I want to add something. His base was Vienna. His base, that's from where he operated.
Yes.
And we think about Vienna, we think of a Johann Strauss and the Blue Danube, but Vienna, when he came to, in 1934 in Vienna, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, the Nazis tried to seize power in Vienna. In 1934, they almost succeeded. They killed the Prime Minister, Dollfuss, but they did not succeed. But then there was a proto-fascist government in Vienna, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism. So when he lived in Vienna and he created that orchestra, he was looking at anti-Semitism by the Viennese, and the Viennese were known to be more anti-Semitic than the Germans themselves. So he was looking at that anti-Semitism in the face. So he was seeing it with his own eyes. And he stayed in Vienna until he had to leave before the Germans marched in during the Anschluss.
You know, and to that point, Mordecai, we spoke about something the other day that would be good to sort of insert here, which was, why was Huberman so prescient? How did he know what was coming? And he operated as the years went on from 34 to 36, he was more and more intense about really getting as many Jews out as he could, not just the musicians, but other Jews as well, like Dorit Strauss's aunts that are mentioned in the film, Tony and Rosie Grunschlag. He got them out to London, nothing to do with the orchestra, because he knew what was coming, and he knew that the Jews he didn't get out would be in great danger. How did he know that? My guess is, and Mordecai agreed when we spoke the other day, because he grew up in Poland, born in 1882, he saw pogroms firsthand, and it never left him, how bad it could get. And when he went to Germany and then Vienna, he had that in his memory. And as it got worse and worse, he knew what was coming.
I agree. Very good.
Okay. So more questions. So one question is this: was there ever any attempt made by the Nazis to arrest Huberman, or did his role as a world star somehow protect him?
It protected him. They never tried to touch him. There'd be such an outcry. It was like Mussolini tried to stop Toscanini from leaving Italy. The entire world came down on Mussolini, and he had to let him go and give him back his passport. So that would have happened with Huberman. So they never tried to touch him.
And incidentally, he was out of the scene when World War II broke out. He happened to be in South Africa on a tour, and he got stuck there until the end of the war. So he was pretty safe throughout the war.
Actually, not quite. A little adjustment to that, Mordecai. He made his way back to New York, and he actually lived throughout the war on West End Avenue.
Oh.
Yeah. So
there's a question about Huberman after the film ends, I guess. Yeah. So he goes back to Switzerland, is that right? Why did he not make Aliyah? Why did he not stay in Israel? And then he died shortly after Israel was established, did he not?
Yes, he had no interest in making Aliyah, although he had become a Zionist in 1934 by the persuasion of Einstein, who was his good friend, and finally was able to convince him of the necessity of the state of Israel after a year of Hitler. He never had any interest in moving to Israel. I mean, he was a European. He was an assimilated Jew in Europe, and he needed the world, and he needed a base in Europe, and he preferred being there.
Josh, I'm not so sure, because from the film and from what I've read, by the end of World War II, he was basically not a healthy person. He was sick, and he had this accident with his arm. It took him a long time to recover the use of his fingers. And then he died in 1947. He died 2 years after the end of the war. I suspect that if his health had come back, and he would have seen the rise of the state of Israel, which happened a year after he died, we don't know. Not all Jews who came to Israel, when Israel became a state, were diehard Zionists. So we don't know. It's an open question.
Yeah, we don't know. Just the man that I researched and got to know, it seemed to me he was not about to move to Israel. The accident was in 1937, and he got the handbag. He was in a plane crash, and 1930, and his hand was crushed. And Ida Ibikin, who was his companion and his lover, was a nurse, which is how they met. And she gave him physical rehab and got him back. And he did go back to Palestine one time after the original 1936 series. He went back in 38 when Toscanini came back a second time. And he played the Beethoven concerto with the Palestine Symphony in 38 with Toscanini. The only time he played with the orchestra and the only time he ever played with Toscanini. But he never went back again.
So here's a question for Dr. Paldiel, and it's as follows. Is the Huberman story known in the Holocaust remembrance community today? And how well is it known, and by whom?
It's the answer is it's known among a small circle of people that are collected with around the musicians of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra. It is known by Zubin Mehta, of course, but it's not talked about. There are no TV programs which show the story of Huberman. And Yad Vashem, for the 24 years I was at Yad Vashem, I never saw anything. All their programs which dealt with Huberman. About partisans, yes, many. About the Warsaw Ghetto, every year. About righteous Gentiles, yes. About the nasty Nazis, so many programs, so many conferences, so many symposiums and colloquiums. I never, so I heard of the name Bronislaw Huberman, but if somebody had asked me 2 years ago, what can you say about Bronislaw Huberman? I would have said, maybe there was a person by the name of JOSH ARONSON, he can tell you more. I didn't know JOSH ARONSON then, but it was totally ignored. And it's still not known among the white public. It's not a part of the educational system in Israel. Israeli youth are encouraged to go and visit the Warsaw Ghetto and talk about the uprising and so on. But the story of Huberman has not yet been integrated into the educational program of Israel, of the Ministry of Education. And even at Yad Vashem, I have never heard of a talk about Bronislaw Huberman.
You know, down to another level. Sadly, I think one of the reasons for that now is that Israeli youth are more interested in Taylor Swift than Mozart.
Yes.
And so classical music, like everywhere, is being marginalized, and so they're not being educated. Yeah.
Okay. So how can this be rectified?
First of all,
people like Mordecai on the case.
Oh, no. People like JOSH ARONSON. First of all, the film. The film moves a million miles, it opens a million hearts. And I must congratulate you, JOSH ARONSON. It's very well done, the film. It tells the story. It leaves all the important elements it has inside. And that film now should be shown in Israel with Hebrew subtitles. You should get in touch with Cinematheque, and they should show the film in the Cinematheque houses, which they have in Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. And then an effort must be made by the Ministry of Education. There is now a new government, there's a new minister, and try to introduce that film and show it to students, high school students, with Hebrew subtitles. It can be done and should be done.
Mordecai, that has been done in an ongoing way. It's been at the Cinematheque and it's been distributed. There's been theatrical screenings. Although curiously, the festivals, I think to the same point, because it's not a popular subject, populist subject. The festivals, the Doc Festival and the main festivals in Israel don't want it, but it's been shown in schools and but not on television either. Yeah, I don't know why.
Yeah, somebody who has contacts of a purchase of the Ministry of Education should try to introduce that as one of the study materials for high school students when they study the Shoah, the Holocaust, and they study about different aspects of the Holocaust. They should also have something about Bronislaw Huberman.
Yeah.
Now there's a question about the violin. And so, of course, you go into it, but there's another movie, a whole movie about the loss and recovery of the violin, right? Can you maybe summarize the story of the violin?
Yeah, that's the movie, by the way. That movie, which has a little bit about Huberman and our story, has been on Israeli television. But it's a more of a sort of a suspense story about finding the violin. The violin was stolen in 1936 from Carnegie Hall by a man who was a journeyman violinist, whose mother encouraged him to see if he could find a better violin because it would improve his career. So he saw that Huberman was playing in Carnegie Hall. He snuck into Carnegie Hall, went through the back ways of Carnegie Hall, which I knew very well because when I was in college, my friends and I used to sneak into Carnegie Hall that way because you could get in on the side, go upstairs up to the 8th floor, come back down some interior stairway and go right into the orchestra and not pay for your tickets. Now, we were 18. We don't do that anymore. And they've closed off that passageway. But he did that, and he got back to the green room or the dressing room where the violin was, between concerts, but between different pieces that were being played. Huberman was on stage playing with his other violin, and he left his Stradivarius with the door open, or Ida Ibikin did. And the man simply walked in, put the violin in his coat, as Josh Bell says, and left, and played it for 50 years. And he played it in gigs, he played it in studios, and he had covered it with black shoe polish so no one would recognize it as a Stradivarius. And when he died, he told his wife that it was a very special violin and she should bring it back to the world. And she found all the paperwork and all the articles in the violin case. And so she brought it back to Lloyd's of London, who had insured it. And she lied to them, actually, about how her husband had gotten it. And Lloyd's of London ended up paying her a finder's fee. And they cleaned up the violin, and Josh Bell bought it. He was the second buyer, actually. And that's how it came back in the world. It was just one of those, extraordinary stories.
Now, there's another extraordinary story, which is the story of Violins of Hope. Mm-hmm. And you interviewed Amnon Weinstein in the film. And so there's a question. First of all, can you explain about Violins of Hope? And secondly, the question is, do you know if members of the original Palestine Orchestra donated their instruments to Amnon Weinstein's father, Moshe?
No. Violins of Hope. Amnon, by the way, who's in the film, the man with the bushy mustache. And every woman I know falls in love with him on the film because he's a manly, burly man. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy who lives in Jerusalem. And great stories about him. His father, who's referenced in the question, and also I read it, his father was the master violin maker and repair person in Palestine, and he grew up in that. And so he tells the story when he was young of Itzhak and Pinchas being brought to the shop to have their violins being repaired when they were 6 and 7 years old. And Amnon, who's a little older, remembered them playing and described to me what it sounded like to hear Itzhak Perlman play at 7 years old and Pinchas Zuckerman at 7 years old. And he said it's like nothing you could possibly imagine, that kind of, just vivid talent coming down through a child in that way. And Huberman had to have been that way for him to have the same kind of thing. And when we were looking for a prodigy to play in the film, as you see early in the film, that scene with the little boy, he was a prodigy in Berlin that we found. And I sent his tape to Amnon to see if he remembered if that sounded appropriate, if it sounded like a prodigy would sound. And he said it wasn't even close. So he had to have someone dub the sound of that child. But Amnon's Violins of Hope is an organization that would get Holocaust concentration camp instruments. So they weren't the instruments of professional violinists. They were instruments made for concentration camp Jews. And they were all very low-end violins, and they were made for the concentration camp orchestras. And they all had Jewish stars on them. And they, as I said, they weren't particularly good. And Amnon went around and collected these violins, and he restored them. It's been his life's work to restore these violins and to have great violinists take them to the concentration camps and play them in honor of the dead Jews. And he's done tours with them all over the world and done photography shows and art shows. And it's his life's work. It's beautiful work. And he's a very beautiful man.
If I may add something to this, when I worked at Yad Vashem, I met a very interesting person, a man by the name of Jacques Strumza. You can read about him if you Google the name Strumza, S-T-R-O-U-S-M-A. What is his story? He was born in Salonika, Greece, and he was he was deported in 1943 to Auschwitz, and he was a violinist. And when he came to Auschwitz, he took along his violin. He got off the train. The SS saw him with his violinist, and they asked him, "Is that yours?" "Yes." "Do you play the violin?" "Yes." "Step out of line." And he stepped out of line, and then he was invited to play before the SS officers over lunch with his violin. And they liked it very much, and that saved his life. Of course, later on, the death march, but basically, he claims it saved his life in Auschwitz. After the war, he came to Israel, and he volunteered work at Yad Vashem when he retired. And then he was invited by the West German government to come to Germany and speak before high school students, Strumza. And he brought his violin, and he said, when I came to Auschwitz, and then he said, "Do you know how I survived Auschwitz?" Then he pulled out his violin and he started playing to the students, and they were all in tears. And every year he was invited to come to Germany and perform with this violin before high school students in Germany. That's how I survived, the violin. And he has since passed away. I think he donated the violin to Yad Vashem.
There's so many stories of Jews and music, and the Jews that were saved by music. Someone on the call, Mona Golombek, who many of you know of, who wrote the wonderful book, The Children of Williston Lane, and has a one-woman show. And it's about how her mother was saved by music, and was saved on the Kindertransport ultimately, and went to London. And because of her abilities, got a scholarship to the Royal Academy, and spent her life knowing that it was music that saved her, and gave music to Mona and her sister, who became world-class pianists. So music and the Jews is an old, rich story. There's no doubt about that.
So there's a question about the distribution of the film. The question is about the subtitles, but maybe you can answer more broadly. Question is specifically, are there any efforts being made to dub it or translate it into other languages, Italian or Spanish, in the context of countries or locations where Toscanini is admired? But talk about the distribution and where the film can be seen.
Yeah, well, the film can be seen wherever there's Amazon Prime in the US, you can see it for free. We set up a Vimeo on-demand site, and that's in the UK, also Amazon Prime in the UK, and Vimeo there, and in Israel, there's a Vimeo on-demand. Other than that, the distributor, the North American distributor, is First Run Features, and they can send it out for streaming and so on for educational markets. It's been screened all over the world in Jewish and Holocaust centers. It's been, we have translations and subtitles in Hebrew, in Hungarian, in French. We do not have it in Italian or Spanish, although it's a wonderful idea. And if the person asking the questions has access to people who might support in doing that, I would love to do that. It's just finding the right connections to be able to do it and then getting it out there. You know, I generally make a film like this, and it went to PBS, and it's been on PBS in America, a national broadcast that was very successful. And from there, we had a distributor, and it's gone to educational markets and continued doing that pretty much regularly. We've not had good success getting it on television in Europe. Why, I don't know. But it's, as I said, in Jewish centers all over the world, it's been embraced, and we keep getting calls for it over and over again. Anyone on the call who has ideas for how we can get it out further, and organizations or foundations might be willing to fund those efforts, please find me. Olivier can get you my contact information, or on our website, which is aronsonfilms.com. You can find me. So thank you for the question.
Maybe you should get in touch with the people, with the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. Maybe they want to show it to their students, to the Arab students in the West Bank, and to show them how one person can make a difference. So maybe they can find an Arab BRONISLAW HUBERMAN who will also create something and give their children a chance to be great musicians and for the Arab world. Maybe they can take that example from them.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering if our two speakers have some final thoughts. So I'm going to start with Dr. Paldiel, and then we'll finish with Josh Aronson. So Dr. Paldiel.
when we talk about everything that happened to the Jewish people in the Nazi period, there are no final thoughts. There are a lot of questions, a lot of open questions, and few answers. But there are stories. There are some most beautiful stories to come out from the Holocaust, rescues of Jews, non-Jews and Jews. And these stories can serve, they must serve as enlightening role models. It can show, the story of Huberman especially is a story of one person, not even two, just one person creating a miracle by relentless efforts over a 2-year period. So if one person can save that many Jews and not give up instead of all the obstacles, imagine what people can do under normal circumstances. So we have to show the example that these people were not superhumans. They didn't come down from heaven. They were human beings like ourselves, and they can inspire us to do acts of humanitarian acts and altruistic acts for the benefit of humanity. So we have to tell stories like Huberman. Will never have a full explanation about the Nazi period and the Holocaust. That boggles the imagination, but we can show by examples of Huberman, we can show where the light is, and we can show where we should go.
Yeah, beautiful, Mordecai. Thank you. I think the most important thing for me out of the film is it's interesting that wherever I take this film, and I dare say, I don't know, through PBS, certainly it's been a huge audience, but whenever I have screenings of the film all over the world, it's always the same audience. And I'm looking at all of your faces here. You are the audience that I see all over the world. And basically they're Jews 50 to 100 years old, all over the world. And we have to have Holocaust education much broader than just us. And that's a real problem. And I don't know what it is now, but at the time I made the film, I think that we're only 7 or 8 states in America that mandated Holocaust education in secondary schools. That's a crime. So I think it's just important that films like this and others, and those of us on here who are dedicated to this effort, have to continue Holocaust education. And as Mordecai said, one person can make a difference in the whole world. I mean, here's one man who started the culture of Israel. He started it, one man, and saved 1,000 Jews doing it. I mean, what a legacy for a guy who was abused by his dad until he was 20. So it's a call to action for all of us. We can all make a difference. And thank you all for coming.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. And of course, I want to give my profound thanks to Josh Aronson, who could have been anywhere else today, but chose to be with us speaking to our audience, and Dr. Mordecai Paldiel sharing his tremendous knowledge with all of us. So my deepest thanks to our 2 speakers, and thanks also to all of you for spending some of your July 4th weekend with us. And I hope to see you at our upcoming programs. So have a nice rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.